Former police officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial will resume Monday after a week of gripping testimony inside the courtroom. Chauvin is facing 3 charges in the death of George Floyd last May: third-degree murder, second-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Jurors heard from several key witnesses in the first week of testimony: the teen who shot the video of Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck and a senior officer in the Minneapolis Police Department both took the stand for the prosecution. Prosecutors argue that Chauvin is directly responsible for Floyd's death. The defense is telling jurors other factors, like Floyd's health and drug use, were the ultimate causes. For more on this, I'm joined now by Brandt Williams. He's a criminal justice and public safety correspondent for Minnesota Public Radio News. Brandt, what were some of the standout moments from the first week of the trial? And, we spoke right before the trial started. I'm wondering, having seen this first week, were you surprised by anything that took place in these proceedings?
Well, I'd say some of the key testimonies so far this week have come from, as you mentioned, some of the eyewitnesses who were there at the scene. Young Darnella Frazier, who shot that viral video, and her explaining how she felt guilty to George Floyd for not doing more. We heard from Christopher Martin, the cashier at Cup Foods, who himself expressed guilt about just not letting that $20 bill slide and feeling like he shared some blame for what happened to George Floyd after that. I think the testimony from the law enforcement officers, the senior officer, Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, was also something that the prosecution really wanted to bring out, that they have these experts who are going to show that what Chauvin did to George Floyd was not something that Minneapolis police officers are trained for. Now, as far as surprises, I think they pretty much followed the plan that they laid out during their opening statements. I think there were some, outstanding things that stood out to me were the paramedics who testified, including paramedic Derek Chauvin, who said when he got to the scene and he saw George Floyd underneath the police officers, he felt like George Floyd had already died.
A lot of emotional moments, and you're actually there where protesters have been gathering outside of the courthouse every day. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about the atmosphere and how you would describe the interactions between those demonstrators and law enforcement.
Well, so far, as you mentioned, matter of fact, I have a bureau office in downtown Minneapolis, which I work out of, and also work out of the media room where reporters who are covering the trial can watch the proceedings from across the street from the courthouse. Now, every day I come in very early, and there was one morning in particular this week when I could hear loud, it sounded like club music coming from across the street from the courthouse. There were already protesters gathering at about 5:45 in the morning, about 3 hours before trial was supposed to start. And there have been a constant presence of demonstrators outside of the courthouse carrying signs. Some of them have posted signs on the fencing outside of there. So far, I have not seen a lot of organized demonstrations, just a few sporadic demonstrations. On the first day, I believe there were some demonstrators who would temporarily block intersections downtown and hold banners expressing, a desire for justice for George Floyd.
This has been, as we've mentioned, a week of really emotional testimony on the part of the prosecution. But historically, it's rare for police officers to be convicted for using fatal force against civilians. I'm wondering, Brandt, is there a sense of what might happen if Chauvin is acquitted?
Well, there's obviously the city and the state have put resources into making sure that if there is a very strong reaction to the verdict one way or the other, that there be security in place to make sure there's not a repeat of the unrest we saw in the city last year. They have implemented what they call an Operation Safety Net, which will allow people to call in tips on any suspicious activity that may be a non-emergency, to make sure that there isn't any activity going on. Because remember last year, not only were there the demonstrators who had there were some demonstrations that turned violent in the evenings. We don't know exactly the full details of all those people, but we also had read about folks who were not from here who were coming into the city to cause trouble. And that's what I think they're also looking out for.
This is such an important trial across the nation, in part because the death of George Floyd became a turning point in terms of race relations in this country. But it is possible, obviously, that Chauvin may be acquitted. I'm wondering what type of effect this trial is having on how we talk about policing, accountability, and racial justice.
Well, there's already been a lot of discussions in Minneapolis, especially even before George Floyd was killed. There's been the Minneapolis City Council had been trying to have a more prominent role of authority over the police department in terms of being able to implement policies and change procedures as they saw fit. But that's something under the city's charter assigns those duties to the mayor of Minneapolis. And so there's been, at least for the last several years, a push by the Minneapolis City Council to wrest some of that control. There have already been, of course, efforts to dismantle the police department and reinstate some type of public safety department, which includes a large presence of people who are non-law enforcement officers, who would be people who can interact with the public, either to diffuse mental health crises situations, or just to be people on the streets going out and diffusing potentially volatile situations.
The trial will resume Monday. What can we expect?
What we expect to see this week coming up, the chief of police is expected to testify. We'll also likely see some more law enforcement officers, perhaps those who train officers in use of force. And we're expecting to start seeing some medical personnel, perhaps even some of the doctors who treated George Floyd at the hospital last year.
All right, Brandt Williams, thank you.
You're welcome.